you for coming. I got interested in the topic of masculinity about a decade ago because I noticed that so many young men were turning to these online influencers for guidance in life, and they weren't going to traditional authorities, churches, pastors, teachers, parents, even politicians. And so I saw this gap. And if anything, this gap has only gotten bigger as the online men's influencer world has exploded with people like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink, the infamous Andrew Tate. Probably some of you have heard of him. And yet men still, by and large, are sort of checked out of churches and places like that. And so I said, what's going on with that? And so I studied what a lot of these guys were doing. And I realized that although some of them are promoting immoral lifestyles or unhealthy or even inaccurate visions of life, they were also getting some important things right. Some things that mainstream society was either unable or unwilling to take on. And, originally I was thinking I would give a talk about why men turn to these online influencers instead of the church. Which is a topic that I've written about before. I have an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about that you can look up. But I thought that would be too boring. And so I decided instead to do a talk for what I hope is a healthy vision of masculinity that's fit for the 21st century. And as I go through this, I will try to work in some of what I got from the online influencer world and my look at that. So I'm going to talk about 10 aspects of what it means to be a man today. Identity, mission, agency, virtue, knowledge, wisdom, fraternity, family, suffering, and legacy. So I'll repeat that. Identity, mission, agency, virtue, knowledge, wisdom, fraternity, family, suffering, and legacy. And I know there's a lot of women in the audience, but I hope you'll find these topics valuable to you too, because while what I'm saying is for men, it's not all exclusively for men. Identity. Identity is the foundation of everything else. It is the heart of everything. Because if you don't know who you are, then you don't know what to do. Right? Again, if you don't know who you are, then you don't know what to do. I said somebody has to have already come up with that saying, and so I Googled it and I couldn't find it. Maybe somebody famous said that, but it really does seem to sum up something about life. And I think one of the greatest illustrations about this is from the Walt Disney animated film, The Lion King. So if Dr. Hansen can talk about Little House on the Prairie, I can talk about The Lion King. Now, The Lion King came out 30 years ago, before any of you were born. And I don't know if anybody watches that today. Has anybody actually seen The Lion King? A lot of people see it. Well, I'll give you a little synopsis here. The Lion King is a story about a lion named Simba. And it starts off when he's a boy, and he is the son of the king of the lions. And his uncle is jealous of Simba and his dad and hatches this plot with a group of hyenas to kill Simba and his father and take over the kingdom. And his plot is actually successful, except for one thing, which is Simba manages to escape. And he runs away, and he ends up in this oasis and far away from where the lions were living, and he meets some new friends, and they sort of take him in. And they've got a saying, which the word I'm going to get wrong is something like Hakuna Matata, which means no worries. And that becomes Simba's motto of life. He's just living this carefree life in this oasis. He's eating, he's playing, he's having a good time. He doesn't have any responsibilities. He's a lion. Nobody can do anything to him. And so he spends years like this and grows up living this life over there. And one day, his father's old advisor named Rafiki tracks him down and starts giving him a hard time. And Rafiki says to him, Simba, you know what your problem is? You don't even know who you are. And then he goes on to say, actually, did you know I know your father? He's still around. He's still here. I can show them to you. And of course, Simba's like, what? My dad's still alive? So he runs after Rafiki, who takes him to this river. And he says, look into the river. And so Simba looks down into the river, and he just sees his own reflection. He's like, I got some bad news for you, Rafiki. That's just my reflection in the water. And he says, look again. And he looks into the water, and the reflection dissolves, and Simba has this sort of mystical encounter with, I guess, the ghost of his father. And after this encounter is over, Simba realizes something for the very first time in his life. He's like, wait a minute. I am the Lion King. I am the king of the lions now. And once he knew who he was, he knew he couldn't stay living the life that he was living. He had to go back and set things right and restore flourishing and peace to the land. Once he knew who he was, then he knew what to do. And that is so important for us to know who we are. So I'll share a little bit about my identity today and how that shapes me. The first is I'm a Christian. And there's a lot that goes into what it means to be a Christian, but I will just share a couple parts of that. In the first chapter of Paul's book of Ephesians, one of the things he writes is, God predestined us to adoption as sons through Jesus Christ to himself. So Christians believe that we have been adopted as sons of God. So in essence, like Simba, we are part of the royal family of heaven. But do we live like that? Do we truly believe it? Because if I believed that I've been adopted as a son of God, then that's a very noble and high calling. That's a high standard to live up to. It elevates our sights in terms of what we want to do and how we want to live our life. It also says in Ephesians that in him we have also obtained an inheritance. So another part of the Christian teaching is that we have an inheritance that can never be taken away from us, that is secure, right? We've got the trust fund that can never be taken away. Now, if we believed that, right, if we truly believed that, then we can make full contact with life, right? I can put myself out there. I can take risks. I can lean into the discomfort because I have something that's secure and I can't lose. And so much of the letters of the New Testament really is just Paul reminding these Christians of who they are. Another one of his lines, do you not know that you will judge angels? Think about that. I'm also an American. So this is my country, right? These are my people. I am not a citizen of anywhere. I'm not a citizen of nowhere. I'm a citizen of this place. And that means I have a responsibility to uphold and a legacy to extend for America, for our country and our people. I'm also a husband to my wife, Katie, and a father to my son, Alex. So I have to think about them. I can't just think about myself. So who we believe deep down that we are determines how we live. It determines what we do. So who are you? What is your identity? What are the things that you believe about yourself and who you are? You know, that's going to inform and shape so much of your life. And, you know, I'd say all of us have multiple identities. There's not just one answer to that question. And in fact, I would argue that it's actually not healthy to try to reduce just to one identity. So if I say I'm just a father and that's all that I am, then if, you know, God forbid my son were to die, which sometimes things like that happen, they do, then I not only lose my son, I lose my identity. We all have multiple identities. Identity is dangerous, right? Once Simba knew who he was now a threat to the people who had usurped, his rightful throne and who were ruling as tyrants over the land. And so the people who run our society, I think in many ways, want to sever you from any sense of identity that might threaten their control. So, for example, think about the way that they talk about America, for example. If you listen to the way that sort of kind of our elite culture talks about America, you would think it is nothing but a collection of historic injustices. It's the 1619 Project view of America. Well, why would they do this? Well, there's a lot of reasons to do this, but one is to make you ashamed of America, to make it impossible for you to identify with America in anything other than a sort of negative context. Because if you identify as an American who stands in a great and noble, if certainly imperfect, tradition, then, you are a potential threat or obstacle to the ways that they might want to transform the country into something else. They also do not want you to have a positive identity as a man. You typically don't see the media say a lot of good things about men. You're much more likely to hear about toxic masculinity and how traditional masculinity is bad. There's so many articles about this. Again, they don't want you to have that identity as a man. You know what a lot of people today de facto seem to want? They want you living like Simba. They want you pulling out your phone, placing some bets on the big game, surfing the porn, smoking the pot, living the consumerist lifestyle, just hanging out in the big city, living the bro life, but just consumption, all about consumption, all about fun in the now. And like Simba, well, he was no threat to the tyrants. He was no threat to the bad guys, to the way the world was being run when he was living that life. And if you're living that life, then neither of you. You cannot let other people rob you of your identity. Because identity is powerful. Identity is foundational. Who are you is the most fundamental question. Mission. Every man needs to have a mission in life. So again, there's multiple things I want out of life, but one thing I would say is my mission is to help conservative American Christians, especially men, successfully adapt and thrive in the 21st century. So that's one of the things that I try to do. And as a man, you are actually entitled to have your own hopes, dreams, plans, and goals in life. And I think too many of these traditional authorities and institutions, and sadly many churches, reduce masculinity to nothing but sacrificing yourself to serve others. The only thing that distinguishes you as a man is the obligation to give up everything that you want and sacrifice yourself for the sake of other people. Now, service and sacrifice are part of what it means to be a man. It's a big part, but it's not the only thing. You could also be building something that benefits your fellow man. You could also be, conquering territory, in a sort of metaphorical sense. You could be creating. There are many things that you can do that are not that type of sacrifice and service as people miss it. And as Jordan Peterson put it, why do people turn to Jordan Peterson? Here's what Jordan Peterson said in 12 Rules for Life. You have some vital role to play in the unfolding destiny of the world. And I think that's just a more powerful way to think about it. What role do I have to play in the destiny of the world? And he goes on to say immediately after that, you are, therefore, morally obliged to take care of yourself. In other words, you're not actually much use to other people or to the world, if you're not healthy, if you're not thriving as a person. And so if you are a man in the audience, the most important thing that I want to tell you today is this. You matter. You are important in your own right as a person, not just because of what you can do for other people. Your well-being matters. Your hopes and dreams matter too. And again, that's not a call to the self-centered life, but it's to recognize that you have valid interests of your own. And again, even if we think about it in terms of service, there are so many ways to serve civilization in ways that don't look like the way we've traditionally thought about it. Think about Elon Musk. Elon Musk has revolutionized rocketry, revolutionized electric cars, revolutionized satellite communications. He's bringing free speech back to the internet. That's just one guy who's had a profound influence on society. And I don't endorse everything that he does, but that's an example of a man creating, building, transforming for the better. So what is your mission in life? And then what are your kind of hopes and dreams in life? Something to think about. Now, if you don't have a mission, if you don't have a direction, then basically what's going to happen is you're going to end up on autopilot to some destination that you probably did not select. And you're going to turn around years later and you're going to say, well, how did I get here? Or you're going to say, oh, wait a minute. I missed my best opportunity to get to where I wanted to be in life. And, now I'm behind. So, as college students, I think it's certainly okay to not have everything figured out yet because you're just now coming into life. But, finding your mission, thinking about those things can be, in a sense, your short-term mission. And I think there are probably a number of things you're thinking about, like, someday I'd like to be married and have children. Well, I can tell you, someday gets here a lot faster than you ever imagined possible. So you want to make sure, that you're taking the appropriate steps to make sure you get there when that someday comes. It is important to have a mission in life, to have a direction, to have something that you're doing. And by the way, women don't want to be with an aimless guy who's just gambling and consuming. They want a man who's doing something. Agency. You have to believe that it is possible for you to do something to make your mark in the world, or you're not even going to try to do it. And there are things that we can't do anything about. Every day, I open up my computer and I read all these articles about all these very distressing things that can seem overwhelming. And, there are some people who are in very bleak circumstances that does limit, what they can do. But, you have to believe that there are things that you can do, that you have positive steps that you can take to start realizing your identity and your mission, even if it's just the small first steps. That's one of the things that former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink does so well. He's a huge author and podcaster. And, one of the things he just does is just show people you can actually do this stuff. So, people will tell him, oh, I don't have time to work out. I have kids. I'm too busy at work. There's so much going on. He's like, no, have you ever thought about getting up at 4:30 in the morning to work out? To be fair, that's not when I work out. But one of the trademarks of the Jocko Willink land is people posting on the internet pictures of the watch on their wrist at 4:30 in the morning as they're going off to the gym. He's like telling people, you actually can do something, like get up at 4:30 in the morning and go to a gym, right? If you are a man, I don't know if it's, you really believe this, it is possible to not be on an online dating site. It is possible in the real world to walk up to a woman and ask her on a date. Like, that is a possibility. You can actually do that. And so you have to have that sense of agency. Jordan Peterson, back in the old days, one of his famous lines was, clean your room, bucko, clean your room. That was one of his most famous sayings. And I love the clean your room message because it works at multiple levels. At one level, it's a metaphor. And you can think of it very similar to what Jesus said about take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. The idea here being you need to first take care of your own business, what is within your span of responsibility before you go out in the world and presume to start telling other people or doing other things there. You got to clean your room. You got to clean your room. But the great thing about it is, all these like kind of disturbed, kind of lost boys that he attracted, if you don't know where to start, you literally can start by just physically cleaning your room. And you could have a sense of accomplishment. And then you can move on to the next thing. There's a very similar sentiments expressed in a viral commencement address by former Navy SEAL Admiral William McRaven, where he said, "Make your bed." In fact, he turned it into a book called Make Your Bed. I haven't actually seen it. You can go watch the speech on YouTube. It may have actually been at UT Austin. And I love Make Your Bed. It functions similarly. In fact, 10 years ago, I was trying to we got to have a morning routine, right? So I wanted to have a morning routine. And one of the things I did in my morning routine is I'm just going to physically make my bed every day. I'm just going to start doing that. It works as a metaphor, but it also works literally. I mean, we might be a long way from our destination, right? We might be overweight and out of shape, and we're not going to change that today in one step, but we can say what? I'm going to walk 1 mile a day. I'm going to start walking 1 mile a day. Then I'm going to start walking 2 miles. Then I'm going to do 5 push-ups. Then I'm going to start doing 10 push-ups a day. And you just keep building and building in that direction until all of a sudden you get someplace. You have to believe that progress is possible and that you have agency to move in the direction of your mission. Virtue. Virtue is not just about morality, although that's a big part of it. It's about developing your potentialities and becoming the man you want to become, right? To live out your identity, to fulfill your mission. You can think about, are you healthy and strong, right? Are you eating right and going to the gym? Or again, are you smoking pot and gambling on sports all day? One is more virtuous. One is developing your potentialities. The other is, less so. And so there are many lists of virtues out there. We heard earlier about the cardinal virtues. There's the theological virtues. But since I mentioned these online men's influencers, I want to mention the tactical virtues, which were promoted by a guy by the name of Jack Donovan, who wrote a very, very widely read book called The Way of Men. Now, Donovan's a colorful character, to say the least. He's a former priest in the Church of Satan. He was a former member of the alt-right, so I would not necessarily recommend this guy, but his stuff is very influential. And he talks about what he calls the 4 tactical virtues, which are strength, courage, mastery, and honor, which I think are all good things in their proper place and, in essence, quintessentially masculine virtues. And one reason I wanted to mention Donovan is because Donovan has an answer to a question that I've never seen a pastor or religious figure or traditional authority figure be able to answer. So if I say strength is a masculine virtue, if I say courage is a masculine virtue, what's the first thing that's going to happen? The women in here are going to say, wait a minute. You're telling me women can't be strong? You're telling me women can't be courageous? And so, some pastor hears that and yeah, I guess you're right. So we can't say that's a masculine virtue. And that's how masculinity gets defined in essentially 2 ways. Once they chip away everything from the traditional definition of what it meant to be a man, you're only left with a couple things. Men are uniquely toxic in all these ways, and men are obligated to sacrifice themselves and serve other people. That's basically all that's left of manhood. Now, Donovan has an interesting response to this. And he says, look, yeah, of course, courage, women can be courageous. Of course they can. What makes courage a masculine virtue is that men and only men are judged on whether they are courageous. So if a man is put into a situation like facing battle where he is expected to display courage and instead he runs away, he's a coward, he's going to be called a coward. He's going to be said to be deficient in his manhood. He failed the test of what it means to be a man. He was put in the test and he failed it. Of course, if he is courageous, he will be honored. He'll receive honor for that. He's being judged on whether he's courageous. Whereas if a woman displays courage, people will recognize that and they'll say, yes, she was very courageous. That's wonderful. She should be honored for that. But if women don't display courage in those situations, nobody ever says, well, you're deficient as a woman. You failed in femininity because you weren't courageous. Nobody ever talks that way. Men are judged. That's one of the criteria by which men are judged is courage. Now, women are judged too. They're judged on separate characteristics. And you might say that's unfair. And it may even be possible through tremendous amounts of societal reconstruction to sort of eliminate that. But right now, realistically, men and women are sort of judged on separate things. And so, again, the fact that he has an answer to that question, I think helps explain some of the appeal that he has. And so I do think strength, courage, mastery, honor, I think those are things to think about. Knowledge. You need to know how the world works. And this is where that online men's sphere, I think, really excels, because they're constantly giving away tons and tons of practical knowledge. Here's diet and exercise tips. Here's how you can start a business or succeed in your side hustle. And of course, here's how you can attract women. Here's how you can make women like you. So let me give you a quiz. Gentlemen, are women attracted to men who buy them fancy dinners, give them a dozen red roses, and send long, heartfelt emails about how great she is and how much they care? No, that's not the answer. I think if we see what are men attracted to, we know it's power and status, confidence and charisma, looks and style, resources like money. Again, we can see it. Who's Taylor Swift with? Right? She's with the jock who just won 2 Super Bowls, is headed to the Hall of Fame, all of these things. And so there's a lot in there. I don't want to go into it, but like these guys just give tons and tons and tons of information. I call it news you can use that you don't get from everything else. You don't get from a lot of people. Now, of course, that's not the only source of knowledge. I would hope that you would not limit yourself to that. College is like the ultimate opportunity in life to spend 4 years acquiring knowledge. But you got to know how the world works. And I think that today we're actually in kind of a golden age for people like you. When I was young, there was no internet. The only thing that I knew, the only thing I could find out was what was in my local newspaper, what the teachers taught in school, what were on the 3 TV networks. There were really no alternative channels of information. Today, that's not true. Now, there's a lot of fake news out there on the internet. There's a lot of conspiracy theories. There's a whole lot of stuff that can steer you wrong. But, today you actually can do the research in a lot of ways. You have opportunities to gain access to sources of knowledge that we never had. You have to acquire knowledge about how the world actually works. Not just how it works in theory, but how it works in reality. Wisdom. Wisdom is about knowing the right thing to say or do in the moment, and it takes a long time to acquire, and we often acquire it through the proverbial school of hard knocks. Aeschylus says that wisdom comes alone through suffering, and that's probably an exaggeration, but there's a lot to that too, right? It starts when we're little kids, and our parents tell us, don't touch that hot stove, and we do it anyway, and we get burned, and then we say, I don't think I'm going to do that again. And so, hopefully as we go through life, you're acquiring more and more wisdom about how to apply your knowledge, apply your virtues in the real world, in the moment, because nothing will destroy you and your mission like folly. Fraternity. Every man needs a band of brothers. We talked a little bit about this in the previous session. Too many men don't have any friends at all, much less close friends. And I think as we get older, we often lose the friends that we have. As I said, college is a time when you make a lot of friends. I made a lot of friends in college, and in my 20s, every year, we would get together for Taste of Chicago, which was a lakefront food festival in Chicago on the 4th of July. I'd see them every year. As we get older, you get married, you have kids, you move away, different things happen. You see each other less and less often, you sort of drift apart, and it's very easy to sort of, lose your friend network. And just the friends that you have, you actually lose them, and then you're typically not making a lot more. And a lot of men have sort of the illusion of friendships. They think they have friends, but what they think are their friends are really the husbands of their wives' friends. And that's a bad place to be, because if you get divorced, then you lose your wife and your friends. And so I think it's really important to have a friend network. It's important to have friends, but also, manhood is a sort of collective activity in some way. One of the things that Jack Donovan said, again, he says, a man is not merely a man, but a man among men in a world of men. There's a great book, maybe the best book that's sort of been written on manhood. It's called Manhood in the Making. The professor who wrote it, his name is escaping me. He was an anthropologist. He sort of did an anthropological survey of manhood around the world and kind of came up with some of these common themes. And one of the things that was always the case is that manhood was like an earned status. You didn't become recognized as a man until you had gone through a rite of passage or you had demonstrate that you lived up to the code of men in a public setting, in the arena, and you were recognized by your fellow men as having passed the test. And so masculinity is in a sense bestowed a little bit by other men. So we need to have other men around us to challenge us to be living up to that standard, but also to be telling us when we did it. So when I was in my 20s, I had a group of friends from college, that same group of friends I was talking about, and we used to hang out with this group of women who were also friends. And unsurprisingly, one of my buddies became interested in one of these women. He's like, oh, I'm really interested in her. But he wasn't asking her out. So like me and my buddies, we just started pounding him for weeks. You got to ask her out. You got to ask her out. You got to ask her out. And finally he did it. And she said no. But when she said no, you know what? Not a single person gave him a hard time about it. They recognized, hey, it's her loss that she doesn't want to go out with you. You demonstrated, you passed the test. You passed the test. You showed the courage. You took the risk. And people recognize that. So we need people that will encourage us to do these things and then also like affirm us when we do, the right things. And so, having kind of male fraternity, it's the easiest thing in the world to overlook because we live in a sort of atomized society. And today, most of us are sort of interacting with the world through the scroll on our phone. That's not just you guys, that's me, okay? I'm as addicted as anyone else. And so it's very easy to just let this slip. So that's why I think it takes high degrees of intentionality. And again, as I said, if I can't find a friend, I need to struggle, find somebody else who needs a friend even more than you do and be that person's friend. You'd be amazed how that person can become a real friend. Family. When I was in my 20s and my early 30s, I was adamant that I never, ever wanted to have kids. And, when I got into my late 30s, I started questioning that. And then by the time I hit 40, I'm like, wow, I'd really like to have kids. Well, by the time you're 40 and you're just thinking that, now I'm behind an 8 ball. And I ended up getting married at age 46. And I had a kid at age 47. I had my son at age 47, which is amazing that was able to happen. But you know what? We weren't able to have any more kids. I would have loved to have had more kids, but we couldn't because too old. And that's sort of like the consequence of, kind of the way that I lived my life. And, this is something that's probably not going to relate to you, but I hope one day it will. Until we're about 35 years old, we are unable to project our own story into the future. We are unable to connect emotionally to the future story arc of our lives. We know, for example, how much we have changed in the past, but we don't really get it in our gut that we're going to keep changing in the future. So I don't know how old all of you are, but let's assume most of you are like 21. So you're 21. Probably think back when you were 18. Certainly think back when you were 16. Man, I have changed so much. I have grown so much. I have learned so much. But what you can't appreciate is that when you were 25, you're going to look back at when you were 21 and make the exact same statement. I have changed so much. It's hard to relate to the future changes that are going to come into our life. And so we think that we've arrived at a point and we're standing on that point, but we don't realize that you never stop changing in life. Now, the pace of change definitely slows over time. But you are not going to be the same person 3, 5, 10 years from now that you are today. And I'll give you an example of this. I was 17 years old, and I was driving in a car with my dad. And we were listening to the radio. I had the radio on the top 40 station. And I wish I could remember what song was playing. It would be a better story. But it was one of the most popular songs in the country. It had to be a top 5 song. And my dad said, what's this song, Aaron? I've never heard this one before. And I'm like, what? How is it possible that you've never heard this song? This is one of the most popular songs in the entire country. It's everywhere on the radio. And I remember thinking, I probably won't listen to top 40 music for the rest of my life. But I can never imagine there will be a day when I won't at least know what the most popular songs in the country are. Well, suffice it to say, that time came a long time ago. I couldn't name one single song that's popular today. I could not comprehend that I was going to be just like my dad at that future day. I'll tell you another story. We all know that we're going to get old and we're going to die, right? We all know that. But, when you're young, that's just like an intellectual fact. It has no connection. And so you go through life and, relatives die, and that's sad. My grandfather died. I'm like, that's very sad. I'm very sad that my grandfather died. Or, people were sick in the hospital, and I go visit them, and like, wow, it's tough. But then one day, it was around age 40, it was around Christmas time, I got a phone call from my mother. She's like, Aaron, your grandma's in the hospital. I need you and your brother and your aunt and uncle to come down here and take turns staying with her in the hospital because I have a job. I can't stay with her 24/7. So we all came down there. We're taking turns. And I'm in the hospital room with my grandmother. And I looked at her sitting there in that bed. And for the very first time in my life, I said, wait a minute. When I'm 93 years old and I'm laying in that hospital bed, who's going to come stay with me? And the answer was, nobody. Nobody is going to be there for me. And that was a sobering thought. It had never really occurred to me in the emotional way. I could have thought the thought, but it didn't connect with me. And so, we make decisions when we are young that have profound, lifelong ramifications that we do not fully understand. And we do not fully understand how differently we are going to feel about things in the future. And so I think that's why, one of the reasons why, all human traditions sort of respected the traditions of older people. And like they were supposed to have this repository of wisdom. Part of it's just because they've lived through the story arc of life. They see where life is going. And so I say all that to say this. While there are exceptions, and you might be one of them, and while it's a free country, and I completely affirm everyone's right to make their own decision about their own lives, I would argue that the normative path for most men is marriage and children. And if you do not obtain them, one day you are going to feel it at some point, even if you can't imagine that that's possible now. And so think strongly about family. Suffering. When I was your age, I had never really suffered anything. And that's not to say that my life was perfect, but, let's say I was probably the classic guy who used to say he was poor and didn't know it when I was really young. We didn't have much money, but I never lacked for anything. My parents were divorced, but I saw my dad twice a week. He was around, and to me, life just seemed pretty good. And for most of my life, I was just kind of on autopilot. I was very smart. I got great grades. I didn't have to work very hard. I got a good job. I moved to Chicago. My career went well. It was great. And then one day in my 30s, I ended up getting divorced from my first wife. And that was an emotionally devastating experience for me. I kind of had a collapse, for a lot longer than I thought. And I kept thinking, why am I so bothered by this? Because by any objective account, it was an easy divorce. We had no debts, we had no pets, we had no kids, and of course, there's no such thing as a great divorce. But in the grand scheme of things, why am I so bothered? And part of it was I'd never gone through any adversity in my life. And therefore, I didn't have the resources to deal with something that was really a struggle. And former boxer Mike Tyson used to have this saying, everybody's got a plan till you get punched in the face. And I'll tell you something, if it hasn't done it already, one of these days, life is going to punch you in the face. Your wife is going to tell you that she wants a divorce. Your doctor is going to tell you that you have cancer. An officer and a chaplain are going to knock on your door and tell you that your son's been killed on his Army deployment. You're going to get laid off in a recession, and you're not going to be able to find another job. Maybe your house is going to get foreclosed on. Suffering is part of the human condition, and how you respond to suffering will, in some respects, be the measure of you as a man. And that doesn't mean, and I want to be very careful here, is not to say that you need to stoically sort of pretend that everything's okay. What distinguishes genuine suffering is that things are not okay. And you need to experience and acknowledge for yourself that things are very much not okay. But for some people, this knocks them into a ditch that they never get out of. And so when something like this happens to you, you need to find a way to make sure that it doesn't destroy you and that you come out on the other side transformed, hopefully having built new resources within yourself and ready to start rebuilding. And it can be a challenge. I tell people, some people have a quote-unquote starter marriage in their 20s. They get married in their 20s, it blows up within a year, and they bounce back very quickly. Realistically, for most people, if you get divorced, if you're a guy, you're looking at 3 to 5 years, to sort of put your life back together. And it can seem like a horrible thing, which it is. But you can make it through on the other side. And this is where your identity as a man becomes so critical, because when we're in the midst of these sorts of suffering, these sorts of environments, those questions of identity loom critical, and they're where we can draw strength from knowing who we are. And again, if you do not think that you are going to suffer in life, think again, because you will. Legacy. What are you going to leave behind you when you are gone? There's a proverb that says, a society grows great when old men plant trees under whose shade they will never sit. The builders of the great cathedrals of Europe, that is to say, the people who built our Western civilization, started projects that they knew they would never see completed in their lifetime. Maybe not even in their children or their grandchildren's lifetime. So what is our legacy? What is it that extends not just beyond our lifetime, but beyond the immediate span of what we are doing? Your children are one of them. My friend has this saying that when you have children, you extend your span of influence in the world by 100 years. And here is his thought on that. They always ask these little quizzes. They're like, how many great-grandparents' names do you know? Most of us never knew our great-grandparents. Maybe we knew one, really old grandmother or something. I had one great-grandmother I knew for a little bit when I was a kid. They have no influence on our lives, but most of us are very heavily influenced by our parents, and then most of us know our grandparents as well. So if you think about that, you are able to influence the world through the influence that you have on your children and your grandchildren. And that a little part of you continues on in the world for 100 years on account of the influence that you had on them. Sometimes the things that we do, they propagate too in ways that we don't even think about. A few years ago, I said, because this whole concept of male fraternity was important, and I knew I had mostly male readers, and so I said, hey, email me. If you're interested in connecting with other readers of my site near you, email me, and I'll make these connections. And so I did that. It was a lot of work, more work than I thought, to manage it all manually. but I never really saw what happened to it. And then I was actually in Arizona earlier this year speaking at an event at ASU, and I mentioned that, and one of my guys is like, hey, come get together with us. You connected us a few years ago, pre-pandemic. We still get together. Our families go on camping trips together. It's been like the best thing that we've ever had for us to have this like group of guys, other Christian guys to hang out with. And I'm like, man, I'm blown away that little email I sent out, had that impact. And so we don't always know what our impact is. But I think the key is, we have to have a perspective that's larger than ourselves, that extends beyond ourselves and even beyond, the span of our lives. Because if you're a man, I think most of us, we want to leave our mark on the world. We don't just want the world to leave its mark on us. And again, legacy is not necessarily something you think about a lot when you're younger, but there's a lot to that. What will your legacy be? So that was a lot of points. And, I really barely scratched the surface of them. And, somebody could write a book on each one of those 10 things. And in fact, I think there's probably been multiple books written on them all already. But I hope they're going to give you a start at thinking about what it can and should be to be a man today there with, again, identity, mission, agency, virtue, knowledge, wisdom, fraternity, family, suffering, legacy. That is a lot. But you know what? You are all just getting started in life. And I'm kind of known as a contrarian thinker. And like one of the things I'm contrarian on is Generation Z. Everybody has so many bad things to say about Generation Z. And to be honest, I think the best of Generation Z is the best yet. I see so many people who are like optimistic. They're I'm like, so many of us Gen X and boomers, we're all like down in the dumps about the decline of Christianity in America. Like Gen Z people never knew a Christian America. You're like, wow, we're just here living out our faith. There's a totally different perspective on the world. And so I think there's, the boomers are still around. Us Gen X guys will be around a little longer, but the boomers are probably going to be Xing the leadership stage, within the next decade. And then guess what? It's going to be your time on stage. And I hope that I live long enough to see what you all can do, because I'm actually optimistic that Gen Z is going to do some amazing stuff in this life. So I wish you all the best in flourishing in it as men and women. Thank you.
All right, we've got time for a few questions, so go ahead and raise hands, those of you that have them.
Hi, so my name is Soren. I go to the University of Texas at Austin.
Yeah.
I was really interested to hear this talk. I really appreciate your perspective. I thought I was a man for 9 years, and so I think the more I've spoken to men, the more I've realized how out of water that was. But I guess to get to my point, you were talking about service and sacrifice as a condition of manhood, and I know that within the conversations I've had with women, that's something that we talk a lot with women too. And I was intrigued by your definition of masculinity, not as these individual traits and whether or not they're exclusive to men, but rather whether or not men exclusively are judged for them. And I know that in my experience, at least, service and sacrifice are something that women are judged for in different ways, of course, because we're different. But to bring that together, do you think that maybe this is evident of a larger cultural struggle between community duty and a need to mark oneself as the individual? Because I feel like that struggle that I'm seeing men and women fall victim to, or maybe, fall into rather, regarding service and sacrifice, like maybe it's because we're pulled in that direction of individualism, yet we still have this desire to connect with one another. I'm just interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and again, that book, Manhood in the Making by David Gilmour, that's his name, actually, I recall, David D. Gilmour. He talks about, what all these different cultures had thought about, and had thought about being a man. And there were a lot of differences, but he came down with a few things, which was, that you had to be a good provider, in the sense that you had to provide not just for your family, but for your community as well. You had to be the classic protector, which was you had to go out in battle, you had to go out on the hunt, those things, and you had to reproduce, you had to procreate. You're sort of measured. Did you, are women attracted to you? Were you able to marry? Were you able to father children? That was a big part of it. And then other elements come in terms of again, that manhood was an earned status. You didn't just get. It wasn't like you hit a certain age and now you're officially considered a man. It's like you had to go through a rite of passage. You had to prove yourself. You had to demonstrate, right, when you're out with other people in the hunt or in battle that you're measuring up. And it's competitive. It's in the public eye. It's in the arena. It's about energy. It's about autonomy. It's about being able to make your own decisions, having big agency, those sorts of things. And, again, we can recognize that as essentially having an amoral context. One of the examples people have given is that, why are we so drawn to mob figures? Michael Corleone. In a sense, they embody that, that aspect. They just happen to do it in a morally incorrect manner. And so there's also, I think, in terms of being a good man, you would also have to say that someone has to, live in accordance with a moral manner. But I think, the part of it is thinking about sacrifice. There is an element of sacrifice. Men have always been viewed as somewhat expendable. And there's a sort of a lot of the explanations of this are basically out of evolutionary psychology. So it'd be yes, sperm is cheap, eggs are expensive. If all the men but one die, you still you could rebuild society, but you lose your women. It's like all this stuff. And there are these studies that something like only 40% of men who ever lived ever had a kid. And so there is the sense in which, if you're a man, you were expected to go out and fight the battle and die, right? And you're expected to sacrifice your life, if necessary, for the community. But there's more to it than that. And so one of the things Gilmore uses as an example, the big man of New Guinea. And this thing is, one of the things that distinguishes the big man is that he's a large-scale, and Gilmore's word is he's a large-scale net producer. That is to say, he's acquiring immense wealth, and he's throwing feast, and he's giving it away in gifts, and he's reinvesting it in the community. He's building up the community through essentially production activities. You can think about, I am someone who's like a great hunter, and so I'm bringing home lots of meat, and it's not just to feed my wife and kids. That's the other thing is, it's not just about your wife and kids, it's about the community. It's about building civilization, if you will. And so I think that the sacrificial aspect is definitely there, right? That, you're expected to go out and fight, just like, Socrates was supposed to fight. I think it was Aeschylus who had put on his tombstone that he had fought at Marathon. That's how he wanted to be remembered. Not that he was a great poet. And so that's true, but also the idea of just being a producer, just being a civilization builder. I think that's a big part of it that gets overlooked. Someone like Elon Musk is a large-scale net producer. He's producing immense consumer surplus, you might say, that are benefiting people far beyond his own personal, again, not everything's great, but the benefits of what he's doing. He wants to colonize Mars. He's working for that. Maybe that'll be his legacy, but so much and I'm inventing electric cars. Now, of course, I do think that, women get judged on, whether they're good moms. There's a lot of things like that women get judged on too. It's often done, I think, in a different way. But where I think is the idea is that sacrifice gets coded as that is exclusively what it means to be a man, to give up everything. Whereas I think if you look around, if you read Gilmore's book, the production aspects, the civilization building aspects probably loom larger than just, feeding your wife and family, although that's part of it. I don't know if Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dylan, and I'm from Baylor University. My question for you would be, how does a man face grief, loss, pain, suffering, heartbreak, and tragedy in a way that best serves his development and strength and wisdom?
That's a great question. And it's not easy, and it depends on the domain. This guy who's not a Christian, he wrote this blog post. It was very moving, and his son, he had a young son who'd gone in for routine surgery, and there was some complication, and his son essentially ended up, brain dead. He's alive, but he's like the proverbial vegetable for the rest of his life. And he says, people ask, how do you go through something like that? He's like, well, I am going through it. It's happening. I don't have any choice. I'm just going through it. I didn't have a choice in that. And so I think, I think there's a lot to it, and it depends on the context. My friend, who he and his wife had he's a pastor, but his wife, they lost a baby, and their baby died. And he's like, it was horrible, but going through that, we just had to make the decision up front. This is a key decision. We are not going to abandon our faith in God on account of this thing happening to us. That we're going to do that. And so I feel like, those are little things you can resolve. You can resolve, and I'm going to, we're going to do it. So I actually have, a long newsletter that I wrote called What to Do When Your Wife Divorces You. And it's just perspective for someone who's they're just in the early stages of divorce and what's going on. And I think for a lot of guys, I'll use divorce as an example because, I know something about that. It's you think that it's just, it's just bleak, everything's going to be terrible. Your life is over. That wasn't necessarily what I thought, but a lot of times it's guys, they feel like their whole world's collapsed around them. They've lost their home. They lost their kids. They get a massive child support bill. They're getting screwed over in court. And all this stuff's happening, and you don't realize that actually it's going to be a long period of time, but you will get beyond it. It has there's a certain finitude to that. Now, not everything has a finitude to it. One of my friends has muscular dystrophy. It's and so he's basically on a degenerative disorder that's never going to get better in this world. But from some of that, you can think about that, and so just people give you those perspectives, and that's where it helps to have friends. I mean, the number one thing of value, I think, in some of these situations is to just have friends who will listen to you, rant and rave or cry or feel upset, and not try to solve all your problems. Just be there. Just be there and absorb, your thing. I think there's a lot, and we can think about this, and we have friends that are going through something terrible. It is so incredibly easy to end up like one of Job's friends. And we try to cheer people up and okay, great. What we have to remember is that the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that will be revealed. We'll start kind of preach the gospel to people, remind them of God's goodness, and maybe there's a place for that. I never found that very valuable whatsoever. And I think that's a little bit what kind of Job's friends a little bit tried to do. I'm very inspired by Paul's statement that we should weep with those who weep. Not try to So I think you need friends. That's where you need friends, and you just gotta have the perspective going into it that this is this is something I'm going to come through. I am not going to let this destroy my life. I'm going to cling tight to Jesus. I'm going to be you're going to be praying a lot. You're probably going to be fasting a lot. You're going to be doing these things. But I think number one is just to resolve that no matter what happens, you will not abandon your faith. And there's a devotional. I don't think young people really read this devotional anymore, but it was by a guy named Oswald Chambers. It's called My Utmost for His Highest. And one of the lines out of there, I think, is the most true statement that I've ever heard in my life outside of the Bible. And it still moves me every time I hear it. He says, "Some extraordinary thing happens to a man who holds on to the love of God when the odds are against God's character. And I think there's something profound about that. And so that's what I would say is the first thing you do is like, don't let it shake your faith there. That's, again, it's difficult. There's no formula to getting through the horrible stuff. I can tell you that. There's no formula to it.
Hello, my name is Zach Springer from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you very much for your talk. I very much enjoyed it. Your first point concerning identity as being necessary for a healthy masculinity in the 21st century rang true. It made me think, though, what's the ground of identity? How does one come to know one's identity? One comes to know one's identity through a kind of received tradition in this kind of thing, right? Like a body of knowledge and practices and ways of living and being in the world. And it's through this that people come to know their identity, and they have information about the other points you listed. So this made me then think that it seems that in the current period, there's a kind of turn you see, at least on the internet and mainstream media, to investigating or turning to either non-native or kind of older traditions, right? So because of the thought that like the kind of secularism in the mainline Protestantism that's kind of in the cultural mainline Protestantism or even evangelical Protestantism on offer is inoperative, it's not working. So you see people turn to like, in the mainstream, things like Stoicism, say, or they convert to Islam, or they remain within Christianity and they turn to like Roman Catholicism or Orthodoxy, but they abandon the secularism or kind of the cultural evangelical or mainline Protestantism on offer because they're scrambling to find an identity because they feel like they haven't received one. So what are some things to consider when thinking about the scramble for identity and the phenomenon of people turning to non-native or older traditions?
I think that's a really great observation. The truth is that, much of modernity has been about devouring sort of, received or ascribed identities, and, the ultimate expression of that, of course, is the recent transgenderism movement, which is trying to say that even, the sex that you were born with is not an identity that you receive, that you may, you'll find a source of identity within that might, trump the family you were born to, the country that you live in, anything else. I think a lot of the evangelical world even gets weak on that on Christianity because the idea is, you have to make the personal decision for Christ rather than this idea then telling you is, you are a Christian, you were born a Christian, you will die a Christian, that is who we are in this family, and so I feel like the identities that we have, one reason we struggle with identity is because, again, a lot of our society, everything in our society is about severing you from sort of unchosen identities. If you got to pick your own identity, like that's tough. Right? It's like having 32 flavors of mustard. You feel like you have to, just self-construction of your whole life. Most of us can't really do that if we have no given. So that's huge. And what I do see is, in fact, I agree, a turn to non-Western sources of identity, especially in the online men's space. There's a lot of neo-pagan type movement. And I'm going to get in trouble. I don't know if Rod Dreher is around here. He maybe stepped out. But I'd say this if he were even in here, because he converted from Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy. There's been a huge move of especially young men converting to Eastern Orthodoxy. I think the move into Orthodoxy, a lot of it is driven by a sense of alienation and pessimism about the West. It's like our society is sick. Our society is dying. And so I will try to go to a foreign source to find something solid, to find solid ground to stand on. And so I definitely think that's one of the things that's, happening for people. I don't think you're going to, one of the things, Rod always talks about, he's like, if you're going to Eastern Orthodoxy and thinking that you're escaping all the problems of Catholicism, don't ever do that. It's like, don't think that this is you found the solid thing over here. And so but I do think there is definitely a sense of, especially young people who are very alienated from the West. Conservatives, a lot of them are right-wing people. They're alienated from an America that seems to have transformed in ways they don't like it. And so a lot of things happen. They expatriate. The passport bro phenomenon, if you're familiar with the passport bro phenomenon, like that's an example of someone not seeking identity, but like, this country is like, I'm just out of here. And so certainly I think it's a big phenomenon. And part of it is, I think, it's rooted in this idea that, we can't necessarily, I don't know, it's like, if I don't have this identity, that the identity is like a Protestant or is like based on the cultural dominance of Protestantism in America. And if Protestantism is somehow no longer culturally dominant, that must mean, we have to abandon that identity. And so I don't think that that's the case at all, but I definitely see it happening.
When it comes to the provider mindset for men, one thing that I was wondering is there a chance that men may be restricting themselves when it comes to that definition? More specifically financially, because I personally do not mind if my spouse, if I make more than my spouse, because that's not really an issue for me, but I feel like it may be an issue for most men where they feel like the only way to provide is to provide financially. And I feel like that may be really a very restricted point of view, because I feel like there's other ways to provide. You can still protect, you can still defend without it just being in a financial sense. And I was wondering what your take was on that.
Yeah, there's actually been a ton of research done on that. And the truth is that, in general, women put a high premium on, men making as much or more than they do. That's even true in the Nordic countries, where these are the most gender egalitarian countries. They've done research and they talk about like, who do people marry, and like income was huge. Like it's like, overwhelmingly what they call hypergamy, or marrying up, very heavily on an income situation, even there. And it's well known that like if a man loses his job, like his risk of divorce increases by 30%. And so there's a lot of, research that, shows that, this is certainly a big deal in terms of relationships. I think both in terms of like men and women's psychology and how they do it. And that's not to say that there aren't, there are the occasional stay-at-home dads. There are those people. There's more cases today in which, the woman makes more. Maybe that will change in the future. But right now, it still looks pretty sticky. And there's other things like, women with college degrees tend not to want a man who does not have a college degree. So that's some of them. That's one of the patterns that they say is that women, they maybe they don't insist on marrying up, but they sure don't want to marry down. And so that's what I always got to warn people. Guys, when you say things like, a lot of guys will post on Facebook, oh, my wife's so amazing, I'm not worthy of this woman. If you keep telling her you're not worthy of her, don't be surprised if she starts believing you, okay? That's not what she wants. She wants to think that she married this guy who's like a catch that's going to make all of her friends jealous that she married this baller, okay? And you're basically telling her you're a chump. She was an idiot for marrying you. So there's some of that. So I feel like right now, empirically, it's still very much the case that, income matters. And if you look at the research, like I mentioned Melissa Carney's new book, The Two-Parent Privilege, she talks a lot about what, basically, social scientists practically define marriageability of a man as related to his, income and stability of income. In a sense that a man who does not have, like, the economic security is essentially viewed as unmarriageable. So I think, the reality is, I think in individual cases, it can work out differently, but in the aggregate, it's still very much that like a man's ability, a man's income level counts for a lot in marital stability and in just the ability to get married in the first place.
All right, folks, we're unfortunately out of time for questions. Let's have a round of applause for Aaron Renn.